In addition to the action selector attributes we just looked at, there are also a number of action filter attributes you can use. Action filters apply pre- and or post-processing logic to a controller action and its result. Action filters are the components you want to use to apply cross-cutting logic to your application. That is logic that you must execute across multiple controller actions, but you do not want to duplicate this logic inside of individual controllers. One such action filter is the output cache attribute. This tells the runtime that it is allowed to cache the final output of some action and use the cached result to service future requests. When you apply this attribute in the right places, you can dramatically increase the throughput and scalability of an application. We'll look at output caching later in this course. Another example is the authorize attribute. Authorize allows you to ensure a user is logged in and perhaps in a specific role, like the administrator's role, before the action is allowed to process the user's request. We'll be taking a look at most of these filters during the duration of this course. For now, let me just show you how to apply a filter, and we'll take a quick look at implementing our own custom action filter. Let's try to apply the authorize attribute to our search action. So I'm just going to type authorize. You can also apply additional parameters in here. So I could say roles equals admin. That means that not only must the user be logged in, they also must be in the admin role to be able to access this action. But I'm going to leave that off for right now. We're just going to say that a user has to be logged in to be able to access the search result. Now, after I do a build, if I refresh this page that goes to that action, what actually is going to happen is we're going to be redirected to the logon page because I've tried to go somewhere that requires authentication. MVC runtime and the authorize attribute is smart enough to redirect me to the logon page automatically. If I were to register on this site and provide a username and password, I would then be allowed to return to the Cuisine controller and access this functionality. One thing about action filters is that you can place them on individual controller actions, which mean they only apply to that action, but you can also apply them at the controller level. At the controller level, that particular action filter will apply to all of the actions inside of the controller. So by placing that there, if I again try to go to Cuisine, we're still going to be redirected to the logon page because we still need to log in before we're able to access anything inside of that controller. In addition to applying action filters at the action level and the controller level, you can also apply an action filter at the global level, which means it will be in effect for every single request that is processed by any controller action inside of your application. Global filters are typically registered during application startup, which means we can register them in global.asax.cs during the application start event, just like we did with our routing configuration. You can see inside of application start there is a call to register global filters. It passes in the global filters collection. If we track that method down, we can see that there is a single attribute being registered here. It is the handle error attribute. It is now in effect for every request inside of our application. Now, what exactly does a handle error attribute do? Well, the handle error attribute is used to display friendly error pages to users when something goes wrong. So let's throw an exception while we are inside of the search action, and I'm going to comment out the authorize attribute so that we can actually reach this without logging into the site. Now if I do a build and we come back to Cuisine, what we get is affectionately known as the ASP.NET yellow screen of death. It's the screen that shows you that there was an unhandled exception on the server. It gives you stack trace information and lots of things that you probably don't want a user to see. And in actuality, your users will probably never see this page because by default, this level of detailed error information is only shown when the request originates from the same machine that the application is on, so the local host. If we want to see what the user is actually seeing, we just have to configure our application a little bit differently. So I'm going to come into system.web and create a custom errors element and change the mode to be on all the time instead of remote only, which is the default. So we'll set this to on and save the file, refresh this page. And now what we're seeing is a friendly error view that is inside of our MVC application. So when handle error, when that action filter sees that something has gone wrong, it tells the MVC runtime, please render the error view, which is in the views folder under the shared folder, and it's called error.cshtml. It's a Razor view just like all the other views we've been using. The shared folder we haven't talked about quite yet, but the views that you put in here are available for any controller inside the application to render. If we open up error.cshtml, we could modify this error page that the user is going to see. We could put a sad face there because that always makes users feel better when they see a sad face on an error page. And all of this only happens because we have handle error attribute in place. If we go into global.asax.cs and comment out that line, rebuild the application, we're going to refresh the cuisine. This is what the user would see without handle error attribute. It goes up to ASP.NET that says there was a problem. It doesn't show the detailed exception information. It just says that there was a runtime error. We put the filter back in place and refresh. We'll see the friendly error page. The only problem with the friendly error page is, as developers, it doesn't really tell us enough information to go in and figure out what went wrong. So we'd have to launch this program with the debugger right away. If we just change the web.config, the custom errors mode from on to remote only, that will show friendly error page to remote users, but when we're making a request here from the local host, we'll get to see the stack trace and all the exception details. I also want to demonstrate that it's very easy to build your own custom action filters. So let's create a directory inside of our project. I'm going to call it infrastructure. And inside of here, we'll add a new class. I'm going to call this class logattribute.cs. And this class will need to derive from action filter attribute. This particular class name is in the system.web.mbc namespace, so I'm just going to bring that namespace in. And now we have our choice of overriding from 1 to 4 methods. OnActionExecuting is a method that will be invoked when this filter is in place before your action itself executes. OnActionExecuted would happen after your action executes. You can also look at onResultExecuting, which means the action is finished, it has produced a result, but the result itself hasn't been rendered or executed as yet. And then the final method would be onResultExecuted, which means we have rendered the view, we have produced JSON, something is going to be sent back to the client at this point. Let me just put a breakpoint on these 4 methods by pressing F9, and we'll take a look at the information that comes in. This is called logattribute. And to apply this method to a particular controller or to a particular action, all we need to do is say log, and we'll have to have the right namespace in. And this is a CLR convention where you do not need to have attribute at the end of the name. We can just say log. And now every time the search action executes or any action inside of the controller executes, we should be able to see those methods getting hit. So let me run with the debugger. And we'll go to our cuisine controller. And you can see we hit our first breakpoint here, which is OnActionExecuting. Inside of this action filter method, you'll receive a parameter of type ActionExecutingContext. And I'm going to open up the immediate window by hitting Alt, Shift, and I at the same time. This will allow us to investigate these variables that are being passed to us. So the immediate window is a nice little place where you can enter expressions and they can be evaluated at runtime. So we can just enter filter context and hit enter. It tells us that this has some action parameters. And you can see in the IntelliSense here from the immediate window that you can look at not only the action parameters, but also the controller that you're executing inside of, the request context, the result, even the route data is in here. So of course we could say values controller, and it will tell us cuisine. Let me press F5 to continue debugging. And now we're throwing an exception from inside of here. But we still get to come out to the OnActionExecuted event. Let's clear this out and look at filter context again. You'll notice its type is slightly different. Instead of action executing context, it's action executed context. And there's additional information in here, for instance, the exception that might have been thrown. So I'll continue to press F5, and this is just a quick demonstration again of how to write your own custom attribute. If this really was a logging attribute, I'd want to have code inside of these different methods that might record how much time it took to execute, maybe log things like those exceptions into some repository of error information. And of course, if I was really writing a log attribute, I probably would not apply it to individual controllers or individual actions. I would probably register it as another global filter here inside of global.asax. So that would be as easy as saying filters.add new log attribute. And again, we'll have to have the namespace in. But once we have that in place, log attribute is now in effect everywhere, and we wouldn't need to put it here on the Cuisine controller.